Historia Canadiana is recorded on the unceded lands of the Kanien'kehá:ka First Nation. Good morning, Canada, and good evening, Australia. Wait, no, it's the other way around. It's morning over there. Doesn't matter.
Yes.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to Historia Canadiana. I tried something and it failed. The show where we talk about Canadian culture, society, and things in Canada with two guys who apparently have nothing better to do on a Saturday morning and a Friday evening. So that's always fun. My name is
Yay!
Patrick, and with me, as always, is my co-host Mackenzie. How are you, Mac?
I'm okay, just living my life, doing what I'm doing, living on that vacation high.
How long is your vacation, by the way? I didn't ask
Three
that
weeks.
before. Okay, so it's almost done.
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah. No,
all
this
right,
because this isn't our summer vacation. Our summer vacation happens in December.
right. Okay, yeah, that
And
makes
then I'll
sense.
be coming home. And I'll
Oh,
come home to you again.
yay! We'll talk about it off air, but yay!
Yay.
So today we're going to be talking about a topic that is a bit of a flashback as far as our chronology goes, just because I forgot to talk about it, but I still think it's important because it's an important part of Canadian history, even though it takes place a little bit before where we are fully in our chronology, which is just around the Wilfrid Laurier era, right? Late 19th century, early
Oh,
20th.
Wilfrid Laurier, represent.
Yeah, check out that episode. We just recorded it.
We just recorded 3 weeks ago.
I know. Sorry for anyone who didn't like the interviews that we released. First of all, I don't care. It's our show. We can do whatever we want with it. But second of
And
all,
those
we were
interviews
just,
are dope because Patrick talks to dope ass people.
thank you.
Represent Canadian history, boy. Get your horizons expanded, son.
Get that knowledge. Get that literary knowledge. Get that other, just regular knowledge.
As
Whatever
one
you
of
want.
our wonderful guests said once upon a time, you got to start by decolonizing your mind.
Hell yeah. And actually, that's part of the topic of today's show.
It's Canadian history. It's all about
Yeah,
colonization.
really. No, colonization. I like that one.
It's
A new
colonization,
level,
brother. It's
a specifically Canadian level of colonization, just called colonization.
colonization. Yo, this is the colonization speaking to you now, talking about the big news that they don't want you to talk about. Let's dig into why colonization was good.
No. Oh no. I do not endorse Mackenzie's comments.
I don't endorse my comments.
So today we're using another Rudy Weeb novel, like we did not that long ago when we talked about the Temptations of Big Bear. But this
Mm.
time we're using a novel that he wrote maybe 20 years after that one in 1995, which is called A Discovery of Strangers and is centered around the European contact with the northern part of Canada, right? Which will lead us to talk a little bit about the Northwest Passage, its myths, its realities, as well as different indigenous populations and how they connected or interacted with the European settlers that were arriving, mostly through trade. Um, and of course, before we get into that, always, if you feel like it, support the show in any way possible. You can do so materially through Patreon, which we should record an episode of Pop Canada for our extra monthly show next week or in 2 weeks, something like that.
Yeah. Boy.
Um,
Pop
and of
Canada.
course, if you want to just reach out with a review, that's always great, either by email or iTunes, Spotify, yeah, all that jazz. I don't know. You can do it in plenty of places. And yeah, we always encourage it. So now that that housekeeping is out of the way, Mac, tell us about the Northwest Passage. We'll start off with like the history as usual. What's the Northwest Passage? Why is it important?
Yo, fuck. I was thinking about this last night and for a while now, actually prepping for this episode since we've
Mm.
had 3 weeks for it. 3 weeks for an episode. I still didn't read all of the book, but we're going to push that to the side and we're going to talk about the Northwest Passage.
You read part of the
It's
book
the.
at least.
I did, yes. I
Yeah,
picked passages for the book today.
nice. All right. So Northwest Passage.
This, yeah, It's crazy to me because it's basically the Canadian El Dorado.
Yeah, that's an interesting way of putting it. Do you want to elaborate a bit more on that?
Yeah, so like those that don't know, El Dorado was the mythical city of gold. And when
Right.
Spain was coming to the New World, it was a big thing that they were always looking for. But again, it's a myth. It was never going to be found. What's really interesting to me about our El Dorado, as it were, is like how that connects with Canada, because we don't we there even when you look at why people came to Canada, the Spanish went to Central and South America for
Right.
gold.
Yeah.
Conquistadors went for gold. And the English went to the US for plantations, and the Caribbean, whatever, for plantations, tobacco, sugarcane, cotton,
Cotton.
etc.
Yeah.
Plantations didn't work in Canada, not at the same large scale,
No.
and there was no gold. So they came for the beavers, then the fur trade, right?
At least there wasn't
And
gold when they first encountered it, because like obviously the
mhm,
Yukon or in the north, surprise, surprise, there
yeah,
wouldn't
yeah,
be
but
some. Yeah.
it's all very buried deep down.
Exactly. Yeah. It didn't fit
And
within like
so
the 17th century imagination.
yeah,
Hmm.
instead they have fur trade, and they had fur trade and they had a bunch of people that they could convert to religion. And it's
Absolutely.
almost fascinating to me because it really is the Northwest Passage exemplifies that exploration as the goal. Like
Yeah.
exploration was basically the goal when settling in Canada.
Absolutely. Yeah.
We're just gonna explore as much as we can. We're gonna build fur trade outposts, and the Northwest Passage is that sort of like the epitome of that. This
Right.
mythical passage that will help us explore and make more trading posts.
It's interesting, kind of expanding on this idea of myth that you're talking about, is that the whole eventually the Northwest Passage would be found insofar as we have icebreakers now, and so we can just smash through
Mm-hmm.
the ice and make the passage. But
Yeah.
as a thing with like clear delineations, it doesn't exactly exist. Um, but as far as a myth goes, like all good myths, it evolves and it adapts to
Mm-hmm.
certain standards, right? And I think that's one of the things that we'll be able to uncover with this book in particular, and just general ways, and just generally looking at the history, right? And how the needs of the Northwest Passage and what it represented changed rather quickly, right? Over like a century into
Mm-hmm.
something different than what it was intentionally supposed to do, which is create a passageway to the Orient, or what was known as the Orient at the time, right? So China, basically.
The Orient is outdated terminology, Patrick. Okay.
It is,
Come
but like
on.
broadly, what they would have considered the Orient. So, places in South Asia and Asia
Yeah.
generally where they,
Southeast Asia.
yeah, where they could get spices, right? Instead of having to
Mm-hmm.
go around Africa. Um,
Gotta get those spices, baby. Spice melange.
Are you saying that Dune is an allegory for colonialism by any chance and imperialism?
Yes, and it comes with a dollop of a white savior.
Ah, interesting. Okay.
I don't think you've ever heard that narrative before, have you?
No, never, never. Anyway, by the way, I'm so excited for that second one. Just complete aside,
Mm.
that second Dune has got me hyped more than the book ever did. So, getting into a bit of the history of the Northwest Passage. So, as we were saying, like the whole idea of it began in the 16th century almost immediately, right? French, the French arrive in what became known as Canada, right? And almost immediately, this idea of like, hey, is there a straight line that takes us to Asia, right? Can we get those spices faster? The answer is no, at least not from the St. Lawrence, because very quickly you reach the Great Lakes. And also
Great
you reach
Lakes,
rocks.
baby.
Right? Like there's
Greatest
all
bodies of fresh water. We're gonna have a world war over them. Woo woo.
can't wait. Just honestly super excited for the future on that one. But like there's all
World War
kinds.
Water World, baby.
Oh no. Who knew that of all movies, Waterworld would be the most prescient?
I mean, it's there's not enough water in the world to have it rise all the way over and flood the earth.
No, but to the extent that it becomes a resource, sure.
Oh yeah. I think we're gonna honestly, I think that the movie we're heading towards the most is Elysium.
You think there's going to be that technology though?
I think it more and so far that all the rich people are just gonna fuck off somewhere, and
Smart.
then like we're all gonna keep living, but it's gonna be the most miserable experience ever.
Right. Yeah, that's fair.
Like I don't think we're heading towards the Mad Max of it all,
I mean, eventually, probably certain parts of the world, actually already certain parts of the world are desertifying. So,
Mm.
Um, so this whole idea of using the St. Lawrence River was very quickly, you know, stopped as an idea as far as the Northwest Passage was concerned, or it's like a direct line to Asia, because rocks and just the fact that there is no direct waterway that cuts across North America. And so throughout the 16th and mostly into the 17th and 18th century, as you were saying, the search for the Northwest Passage would kind of encourage exploration throughout what became known as Davis Strait, Baffin Bay, right? The Hudson's Bay, all of this, right? The contours of what we now know as Canada were kind of unveiled because we wanted to find this passage, right? And you see all kinds of famous names, or at least now famous names, try to unveil this, right? William Baffin, John Davis, obviously, who I just mentioned, Martin Frobisher, Henry Hudson, who would obviously give the name to Hudson's Bay, which was another entry or attempted entry point into the continent. Um, but as far as Canada is concerned, and two that we've talked about on the show before, right? We have in the late 18th century people like James Cook and George Vancouver, who would also try to do this on the other side of the continent, right? So specifically, they would look for what was known at the time as the Strait of Anian. I think that's how it's pronounced. Anian. Have you ever heard that one before, by the way? The Strait of Anian. It's another
Mm.
mythical one,
No,
right?
I haven't. Maybe
It's
rings. I
I've
feel like
only
we've talked about it before.
Perhaps it's one of those, again, mythical passages that's supposed to be an entryway into the continent that is supposed to lead to the Northwest Passage. Like it's a straight into the passage, basically. It doesn't exist, by the way. It was never found. Um,
Of
but
course, it wasn't.
basically, yeah, and of course not, because myth. Um, but people like Cook and Vancouver who encountered the West Coast, which anyone who's been to the West Coast knows that it's foggy and rocky, um, will know that it's very difficult to actually find an entryway into the continent or actually even a place to accost on the continent. And so this strait represented like this mythical, entryway, so to speak. Um, and again, never found. Um, but this is all important because, of course, there are all kinds of populations that live more and more towards the north. The Inuit, the Dene, who we'll talk about because they're important to the novel that we're going to talk about. And all of these people, as they left the coast and tried to enter further and further into the actual continent of North America through the north, would encounter these populations. Hence the name of the book we're talking
Mhm.
about, A Discovery of Strangers. Right? Um, Sorry, I don't know. Did you have anything to add so far? Or
No. I think the only thing is maybe because okay, so these settlers, these colonizers, they go in through North America and Central America, and they meet like civilizations and societies still living very differently from how they would live, but they have cities, they
right,
have like gatherings, they have when they meet these populations in the north, I don't think they're quite ready for the the unbelievable total difference in culture and lifestyle of traveling, like the nomadic nature of it,
old.
the tribal, yeah, the cold too, like
Yeah, absolutely. I
yeah.
No, totally. And I guess that's as good a way of segueing into talking about what the indigenous populations of that area were, generally like at the time of contact. Obviously, today they are very different. or at least somewhat different, but they still exist. So the main one, as it concerns this particular book, um, are known as collectively the Dene, right? The Dene exist throughout parts of Canada, but the ones, as we know, in the north, are a people who speak what is closely related to what's called the Atapascan languages, right? Which I hope I'm not going to butcher these names. In Canada, include what's called the Gwich'in, the Han, the Hare, the Tuchone, the Casca, the Slave Dene, the Dog Rib, and the Chippewayan people, as well as the Beaver people. Sorry. So all of these different peoples are connected through a common or relatively related language, right? That is broadly known as the Dene people, right? And basically, Dene is a translation, or basically means person or human, right? Much like a lot of words, by the way, that we just ascribe to a population, just basically means person. It's shocking how often that happens. Um, and we estimate that in the north, right, human habitation in the region started about 25,000 years ago. So later than in other areas, just because why would you stay, you know, in a cold place? Because if you don't have to, why would you suffer that way? But hey, some people be like that. Um, and that in it, regardless of actual timeline, because there's archaeological and historical debate in the stories and histories that the Dene people tell themselves. They maintain that as long as they have been who they are, they've lived on this land, regardless of time, right? And I think that's a better way of framing it, right? It kind of removes a need to control the narrative, I guess, that applying
Mm.
such specific dates tends to do, right? It tends to very much specify and delineate particular ideas, right? And particular peoples and cultures. Whereas the idea of framing it as saying, like, well, we are who we are for as long as we can remember and as long as this land existed. So what difference does it make? Right? And I like that
Mhm.
idea. I don't know if you have any thoughts on it, but I like that way of framing it personally. Um, yeah. Um, and mostly in, pre-contact periods, so obviously just before pre-contact, since we have written records of this, most of the populations that lived up north would, live in small groups of 20 to 30 people, right? That
Mhm.
anthropologists later went on to call local groups, right? That relied on each other for resources like food, clothing, and shelter. But sometimes these 20 to 30 related groups would kind of connect with one another for larger projects, right? Maybe
Yeah, no,
larger
well, so
hunting.
that's yeah, and I think that's a large part of misconception that these settlers were dealing with. They probably saw these local groups and saw them as very much like separate peoples or almost warring tribes. When yeah, there might have been conflict, but it was much more likely for them to all be very well known to each other as one large,
Right.
loosely structured and loosely tied together community.
Which there's a really interesting book that came out recently called The Dawn of Everything. Um,
There's
which
also a really good book called A Discovery of Strangers. I don't know if you've heard of it, but it'd
yeah,
be
yeah,
really good.
yeah, interesting. Yeah, well, I think you should hold on to that one. Yeah. But there's a point in that book, which is like a history slash anthropology book, um, that talks about these, you know, what's generally, and I think a bit pejoratively, referred to as, like, you know, prehistoric, um, populations or cultures, um, as it's you can't necessarily think of them as constantly nomadic, right? Sometimes they settled with one another and then they left and then they came back together, and so there was much more flux to the type of societies that were built in these types of populations, that I think is interesting to consider, right? That sometimes there was a great deal of stability and larger populations brought together, and sometimes it was a bit more fragmented and nomadic, right? But it's important not to necessarily pin down one particular element to these populations. And I think that's a good point that you make in this case, Matt, that probably a lot of Europeans would have looked at it and been like, the fuck is this? Right? Like,
Mm-hmm.
this doesn't make sense with my vision of society, right? Or
Yeah.
history, which is
Or
obviously
just my understanding of anything.
right. Exactly. Right. Um, but nevertheless, despite misunderstandings galore, obviously the populations
They
there
would still
knew.
dock their pay.
We'll talk about that a bit later. But right, these populations like the Dene knew how to live in these areas because they'd done so for generations. And the Europeans, much like you saw in the South when Europeans first arrived, needed them, right? Because
Mm-hmm.
the indigenous populations knew how to snare small animals or hunt or use all of these elements to their advantage in order to create bows and arrows and clubs and spears and all kinds of traps, right? And often they would use the animals that they hunted in like a good cycle, right? And all of these things, again, would require cooperative labor, especially for larger game. All of this, by the way, is related to what we're going to be talking about later. They're not just randomly talking about these things. And generally, it's known now that all participated equally in what was deemed to be the good fortune or bad fortune of a tribe or a group. And when their luck turned bad, everyone suffered. Right? And so whole membership of a local group and not necessarily each family or each individual, it was membership as part of that group that really determined the self-sufficiency of a unit, right? And so again, something that you see in all kinds of indigenous populations in slightly different ways is this idea of cooperation in order to live and thrive. Not necessarily to create cities like you saw in the South, but not
Mm-hmm.
in a way that's, how could I say it? It's often assumed that just because you don't have cities that you're like primitive, quote unquote, but I think that's very
Yeah.
wrong to think of it that way. Just because you don't
Well, it's
have,
also
yeah, go ahead.
we can't even begin to comprehend because
No, it's
that's
just
a
wrong.
big part
Yeah,
of why these First Nation populations were seen as primitive because like it we still don't understand how different their like culture and civilizations were from ours.
decolonize your mind, man. Like,
Yeah, decolonize your mind, bro.
really though, we say it as
Be
a
an
joke. Like,
alpha male.
no,
You know, and it's one of the greatest myths perpetuated by European centric history.
absolutely.
And like and it's because it's there's very little records anymore about how that would have lived. But yeah, no, so this idea that there was like this primitive because even these groups in the far north, we have evidence, archaeological evidence showing that they were trading with the people living down in Central America almost.
Oh yeah,
Like
that is
there was
fascinating.
this it's like this unbelievably huge connected network of trade and belief and fortune and so on and so forth
Yeah,
that people don't seem to understand.
absolutely. Like that's a really good point because not just contact within populations from one end of the continent to another, not necessarily direct, by the way, but the fact that there was a network that allowed like
Mm-hmm.
a piece of pottery from the south to make it all the way to the north, even if it was indirect, is incredible. um
Yeah.
but already,
Well, especially
yeah,
considering what happens in Europe when they can barely get the necessities of food across the border without starting a fucking war with the French.
you gotta love wars with the French though.
Gotta
But no,
love
you're
those
right.
wars with the French.
You're right, and obviously it's not as cut and dry. There were conflicts within North America as well,
I know,
and
of
South
course,
America. Like all of
there's
this
all like I'm
happened as
not
well.
saying it was like this land of utopia or anything,
No,
but
no,
it's
no.
still this. It's a larger misunderstanding. So
Yeah,
don't think of this as like local groups, 20 to 30 people. Think of
no.
this as a very like this very spread out community,
It's much, the point is that it's much
essentially.
more complex than people tend to imagine.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Like these 20 to 30 people weren't just inbreeding with each other for fuck's sake. Like they were probably like ch- changing tribe or changing groups, changing little
Yeah.
communities.
Right. And the, yes, you participate in a group, and I actually don't know about this particular people, but you see this in other populations as well. And it's like this idea of uh, participating in a certain nation was not as fixed as we tend to imagine, right? You, again, you could in some cases go from one group to another depending on what population you were a part of, or what, you know, your culture was generally. And so all of these ideas did tend to, you know, bear fruit in many ways. Like you were saying, they weren't just inbred people. That's just not what happened. um but actually, going off of that idea of trade, so yes, there was internal trade within America, but very early on, right, European goods would start to flow into the north, again, sometimes deliberately through the Hudson's Bay or through other types of contact that the Europeans would make in the 17th century, but also from the south towards the north, again, through all kinds of connections. So to the point where Alexander Mackenzie, the explorer, not the prime minister in this case, who in 1789 would be one of the first people to travel, or at least first recorded Europeans to travel across the continent, um, would note that towards the north, when he where he would go eventually, he saw British, French, and even Russian goods. Right. So there's
Mhm.
already by the late 18th century this clear material demonstration that there's all kinds of goods being traded with the indigenous populations there. Um, yeah, so I think that's highly notable in this case. But direct trade would really begin and kick off with the indigenous peoples in the north um, in the late 18th century, actually, after Mackenzie would kind of realize that, hey, there's like a major river here that allows us to go more towards the north, right? Or into the
What can I
continent.
say? I take a long time to realize things. What are you gonna do about it? Fight me.
Nothing. But hey, at least you
I'm
have a
not the most
river.
observant individual. Are you fucking making fun of me?
Yes. But
The
hey, at least
fucking
now you have a
palooka? You wanna fucking throw hands?
now you at least have a river named after you in the north. So, you know, that's kind of cool.
I think that might be the river I'm named after.
Oh, interesting. It's a different spelling though.
Except I know my parents wanted to be special, or
Right.
my mom did.
Um, so direct trade would really kickstart in the end of the 18th century, mostly with the rise of the Northwest Company, and later the Hudson's Bay Company, right? Especially that the two companies would amalgamate in 1821. But really, those two companies would kickstart direct trade with indigenous populations throughout Canada, but in the north, where it was less, you know, networked and direct than it was in the south of Canada. Um, but obviously, poor transportation and the fact that it's snowy and
Mhm.
cold made it so that it was less available, and like fewer luxury items were traded in the north than you would have seen around the St. Lawrence, for example. But still, trade was done in terms of like primary elements like fish and furs and so on.
Fish.
Hell yeah. And
Hell yeah.
before we talk about the book proper, I want to talk
We're
about,
gonna talk about fish.
yes, let's spend the next 20 minutes talking about fish, if you please. So, what are your
Oh,
thoughts on
for sure
fish?
they're bad. All right. So I went out and I got my bait from that Pro Bass fishing shop there. Fuck yeah, bud. And we hit the lakes, hit the fucking rivers there. And we fucking started fished and fished. And man, did I catch a big one. Gonna put it up on my fucking plaque.
So what are your thoughts on ice fishing versus regular fishing? Eh?
Oh, don't get me started on those little fucking ice fishers. Fucking taking up all the lake space. And it's like, bud, give the fish a fucking break. It's the winter time.
Their little
You're
cabins, they look
ruining
so
my
stupid.
hockey rink. You're ruining my hockey rink with your ice fishing bullshit, bud. Fuck, I just want to get my snowmobile out and fucking plow over all the tiny little dilapidated shacks.
It's okay. Everyone has
Dilapidated as
health
the
care. It's
dicks
fine.
probably are. Fucking compensating for something there, bud.
Anyway, so I
A
want to.
tangent that's probably going to be cut.
It is absolutely not going to be. So before we talk about the novel, I do want to talk about, I think, one of the central characters, even though he doesn't show up much in the novel, and that is John
Mm-hmm.
Franklin. So, and does the name John Franklin mean anything to you? Because he's quite a big name as far as British exploration is concerned, especially in Canada. Mm,
Well,
mm.
I feel like he's going to be about. I'm going to learn about him right now.
Yeah, but I'm just
I have
curious,
to
like
imagine that
if you do know anything about him.
I don't, but I'm sure I can guess. I'm sure I can give a pretty accurate guess about who
Okay,
John Franklin is.
just out of curiosity, go for it. Just based on the name and nothing else. What do you
The
what do you
name,
think?
oh, he's definitely some like white English motherfucker,
Okay.
probably living off of his family name.
Hmm.
Graduated from some special academy, like there's a Royal Naval Academy he got out from.
Yep. Hmm.
And then he was given commission, even though he didn't serve, even though he didn't need it, or he served in a war and he got his commission, even though he didn't deserve it afterwards.
Hmm.
And they were just like, yo, you're the guy that's going to lead the expedition for this Northwest Passage. And he was fucking underqualified and lost a bunch of men. And then he probably had, but then they were probably like, you know what you need? More money, more expeditions. You deserve this, John Franklin. You go, John Franklin. Be a real go getter. You're a keener. And John Franklin was like, fuck yeah, I am. Fuck yeah, I'm gonna go fucking find the fuck out of this Northwest Passage. My mother's gonna get on me about the swearing in this episode, but that's okay.
Okay. I would say that you're about 75% correct with that. The
Yay.
order of the events is perhaps a bit off, but you're pretty like you're
Mm.
surprisingly there, right? As far as
It's because
you know,
he's a historical white dude. They're all the same. You're just hitting Control C, Control V.
with a bit of disaster thrown in everywhere.
Yeah. The only thing that makes this one different from the other ones is that he's not French Canadian.
There you go. Honestly, probably hated the French Canadians actually.
Of
Um,
course he did, and they probably hated him too.
so John Franklin would enter the Royal Navy, so check on that one, at age 14. And he did see action, so check on that one again on your end, specifically in the Napoleonic Wars. And he would serve under famous Admiral Horatio Nelson, who would go on to, have that famous
Yo,
battle
he served. How can you serve under Horatio Nelson and still end up such a dumbass?
because you served under Horatio Nelson, who, I don't know,
Yeah.
I don't know much about military history. Apparently, he was pretty competent. So, Um,
Well,
but no,
he's
so
like he's famous enough that I know about him.
there
That
you
means he's
go.
got to be good at something.
He's got to know something. But Nelson would serve at the famous Battle of Trafalgar, right, against Napoleon.
Yeah.
So that's probably where you heard the name and all that, and Franklin as well. Um, but actually, it was in peacetime, and again, check on this upcoming thing. He was in peacetime that he would achieve fame as one of Britain's leading explorers. But as one source put it, he was also one of the least competent of the British explorers. And it is under his leadership that one of the biggest exploratory disasters would ever happen, especially as it pertained to the Canadian Arctic. So specifically in one of his things, he would lose over 125 men, um, who variously perished on expeditions under his command, which is a much higher death rate than any other explorer in British history of the North. So you were right on that one. Um,
Again, they're all the same. I don't, this isn't something to congratulate me for. This is something to be deeply ashamed with.
I love how in British imperial history you just fail upwards, and that's fantastic.
It's not even failing. You're fucking tripping upwards up the mountain.
You detonated a
It's
bomb and accidentally got flown up to the mountain.
like Christopher Columbus was seen as crazy and they still gave him an expedition to sail around the world. Everybody,
And even people over there consider him crazy, and they still celebrate a day. And he still has streets
yeah.
named after him, like a fucking dweeb. Anyway,
God, what a poser. What a hoser.
so specifically, Franklin would lead 3 expeditions in search of the Northwest Passage, and all of them were sponsored by the British
Sponsored.
Admiralty. They were all sponsored by the British Admiralty specifically, which good
Speaking
lesson.
of sponsorships, have I told you about our
Who's our sponsor this week, Mac? Big Fish.
You can tell me and Patrick haven't done this in 3 weeks because we're especially stupid today.
It's the Northwest Passage. It's a myth. We deserve to be stupid about it. It's cool.
We're talking about El Dorado, folks.
So
Also, what kind of name is John Franklin?
I know, isn't it the most British generic name that you have? Though
No, that's still John Smith, but still,
that is still John Smith. Yeah. Mhm.
is he just like Ben Franklin's distant relation?
I doubt it. They would have been born around the same time. I actually
Hmm.
don't know. Um, but
Anyway,
probably not.
let's talk more about the Northwest Passage, something that makes much more sense.
So interesting point here of the fact that the British Admiralty and then so the military specifically financed these operations. Again, kind of connecting the dots here for people who for whom it's still not clear the relationship between imperialism and military as well as exploration. It's not a particularly, you know, smooth, it's not a particularly subtle connection in this case between the two. It's not just trade, or at least it is, but it's trade at gunpoint. Anyway, um, so the first 2 expeditions were probably the most straightforward, right? They were mostly overland expeditions that were aimed at surveying the continental shoreline of the Arctic Ocean, right? Fair enough, right? You're a bit cold, but you know, there's a bit of a disaster that happens in the first one. Um, there wherein some of the people perhaps turn to murder and cannibalism. But hey, all in all, as far as a John Franklin expedition was concerned, it's probably not as bad as it could get. Actually, it's not as bad as it
Listen,
would
some
get.
people some people just get a case of the munchies for the humans, all right? They just want to have a little bit of a nibble with their buddies.
Right. So, like, they had all kinds of people in this
You
first
don't
expedition.
need 2 arms.
Like, really, you don't need all those toes.
Come on, stop being so ableist, guys. Come on.
So, the first voyage, I should say, started in 1819 and would end in 1822. And there were all kinds of people in it. There were naval officers, indigenous guides, there were French voyageurs, and they would travel from the Hudson's Bay overland, right? And basically, they struggled through about 1,000 kilometers by canoe eastward, um, until they returned inland. In this case, because they were just desperate. They were finding nothing. They were cold. They were hungry, and that's when um, some people turned to cannibalism. Um,
Wasn't that how most searches for the Northwest Passage go? Like
100% yes.
they get really cold, they get really miserable, and then they just turn around.
Yes. And ultimately, in this case, 10 people would die. I don't have it here written how many people were part of the original expedition, so I don't
Only
know if it's
10? Those are rookie numbers.
that's
You
what
need to
I'm
pump
saying.
those numbers up, boy.
That
8 more people.
Franklin's gonna take your advice to heart. You'll see. So 10 people lost their lives in this one, and despite this, it was the first successful mapping of any portion of the north coast of America. So, hey, like you're saying, rookie numbers, 10 people, not that bad. Second expedition, would pretty much do the same thing a few years later in 1825, but they would be able
All
to
these
add.
people died and we had to turn around. I'm sorry. I need to go back to that. Like,
Go ahead.
God, I love the ranking of success by imperialism standards. I'm sorry. Just like we had to turn around, we lost some people and we turned to cannibalism. But we did map the coast. So, like, technically, we're correct. By the way, do you want to fund another expedition
Do you
by
want to
me?
fund two other expeditions? Like, at least the second one happened almost immediately, and they were more successful as far as mapping more of the Arctic was concerned.
More mapped of the Arctic, more people died. Pump
Probably.
those numbers up, baby.
And then in 1845, that's when disaster struck, because
Oh, now it's a disaster.
yes, now it's a disaster. Again, 10 people is not enough. You know, one person's
10
what's it?
people is
Yeah,
one person is a sob story, a million is a statistic, baby.
yeah, exactly. So 10 people, who cares? Anyway, so he would not in 1845, so 20 years later, getting on in age at this point, good old Franklin, he received commands of two vessels, the Erebus and the Terror. So really going hard on the names there and foreshadowing with the word terror. So anyway, the whole point was to continue the search of the Northwest Passage
They're
as one
crawling up the
does.
ass of Hades.
And
Sorry.
they were so basically these two ships entered what is known as Lancaster Sound, which was thought to be the entranceway into the passage, and dun dun dun, it was never seen again. Either ship was never seen again, and that's for a long time all we knew, right? Eventually,
Neither ship was seen again, but still
exactly.
a success. Am I right?
I mean, insofar as it's what would be the British framing of success here? We know that it's a mistake to go in there. I guess that would be the success.
I mean, we know that we just need to throw more people at it. He was successful the first two times. This is just an
Exactly.
outlier. Just throw more people, more money at the problem. That's what usually works.
2 out of 3 ain't bad, yo.
Oh, that's a passing grade.
I
That's
mean,
a passing. I'm
exactly.
not gonna lie. If I had to like grade this expedition using my teacher skills, technically speaking, it'd be a pass.
There you go. So eventually,
John
basically,
Franklin, you pass.
so over time,
Another
and
what? Another white.
god damn it. So eventually enough evidence was gathered through extra explorations that we were able to kind of reconstruct Franklin's final voyage, wherein they spent the first winter from into 1845 at a place called Beechy Island, which is near the southwest corner of Devon Island, which I don't know if geographically that makes sense to you, but that's where it is. And they would continue
Those of
basically.
you that understand the Thousand Islands of Canada, you'll understand that reference. Y'all are having a great time right now. The rest
Exactly.
of us, we got to look at a map.
100%. I have one open on right now on Google. It's not that far in, but it exists. And basically, they would continue into the summer of 1846, where they would go a bit more down south into Victoria Strait, and they would basically get trapped by the ice near there, right? Near another island called King William. And it would take until the following spring that Franklin himself would die. And the other members of the expedition would themselves slowly perish because they just couldn't get out of the ice, or they would attempt to make their way overland to safety. And anyone who has any sense of the Arctic geography realizes that there's sweet dick all up there for thousands of
At least
kilometers
for
at a
now.
time. You're right.
Eventually, we'll discover that sweet, sweet crude oil, baby.
Hell yeah. But
Hell yeah, let's gotta ruin those ecosystems. And then if you go even further, you know what you find? Santa's workshop.
it's a well-known fact.
I think that's I think that's what the British were really looking for.
They just didn't look far enough. Yeah.
Listen, it comes to the same thing. Santa's workshop and the Northwest Passage neither exist. It would have been the same end result.
They exist in our hearts, okay? And that's what's matter. That's what's important. So Basically, the ships were eventually crushed by the ice that would ebb and flow, and they would sink. And a total of 120 men, 29 men died on that expedition alone, which
Mhm.
is, again, the worst loss of life in the history of Arctic exploration. So that for that reason,
God.
Franklin is immortalized as one of the great British explorers because he failed so hard that you just have to immortalize him in the history books.
God damn it, John Franklin. And you know the best part about all of this
Hmm.
is that he isn't seen as like, generally speaking, it doesn't feel like he's seen as some unbelievable screw up or idiot. He's just seen as just another explorer doing his duty for the motherland.
One of the, I think, best cultural items as far as Canadian culture is concerned is Stan Rogers' song "The Northwest Passage," which
Mm.
mentions Franklin just among other great explorers, that Stan Rogers, as the singer, dreaming of the Northwest Passage, wants to emulate. And I'm like, really, bro? Do you want, what do
Yo,
you
do you
want to
even know what
emulate?
you're talking about at that point?
Again, he's thinking of the image of Franklin as this great explorer, as this visionary, but it's like that's a weird flex in a sense.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Anyway, good on you, Stan Rogers. Like,
I
I
guess
don't know.
so.
Did you have anything that you want to add to like the history section before we get into the novel?
Yes.
Go for
I
it.
think it's important to highlight just how formative this hunt for the Northwest Passage is in Canadian history
Right.
and how because it's the Canadian exploration is really fascinating to me in that way because it's one of those places where people don't realize how deadly the exploration actually was.
Yeah,
Like
absolutely.
this wasn't people just exploring through a forest dealing with the nature. Like this was at the level of the kind of exploration through a desert,
Yeah.
where
Mhm.
the environment is actively trying to kill you.
But it's interesting to me because, and I think this segues kind of nicely into the novel because I think that's an element of the novel is that
Mm-hmm.
sense of danger that kind of does exist, at least in the mind of the Europeans, that are exploring and coming into contact with the indigenous populations and the North as a character, so to speak, is that contrary to the Southern expeditions, right, which were very much search for wealth and gold, right, and
Mm-hmm.
resources, you know, which I think alleviated a lot of the stress or perhaps terror that might have been experienced by the early settlers arriving there because they had a goal, right? Whereas exploration is a much less tangible goal than gold, perhaps, right? And so
Mm-hmm.
I feel like that's perhaps a bit more terrifying or a bit of a scarier in a more metaphysical sense, a bit of a scarier concept to try to wrap your head around. And it's what makes, I think, your point all the more salient of why it's an important event in Canadian history of like just
Yeah.
this going forward into this most unknown of lands, right?
Well, it also just it plays into this because to me, there's always been this intangible part
Mm,
of Canadian history.
mhm.
Like there's not this like there's a timeline of events for sure, but it doesn't carry the same sort of like weight and permanence that say an American history timeline goes of
Right.
like settling, revolution, Boston Tea Party, like these very like transitional like point
Yeah.
in the sand events.
Mhm.
Like we definitely have them for sure. I'm not saying that the 1867 BNA Act was not this big thing, but it's also just there's almost this intangible feeling to Canadian history because of the fact that like exploration is not gold. It's not a plantation. It's not something you can just
Yeah.
quantify and commercialize it. Even our most commercialized part at the time, fur trading, wasn't something like you can't we didn't have the tools at the time to turn fur trading into a like production facility business. Like these were
No.
people that still had to go out every day into the exploration, into nature,
Yeah.
find furs, bring them back.
And in the grand scheme of things, like
And
even the fur trade was a relatively short period of time as far as Canadian history was concerned, because
mm-hmm.
it was so intense for so long that you depleted your stock so quickly. So it lasted what 150 years really at its peak, which is nothing in the
Yeah,
grand scheme of history.
no,
So yeah, I
and
think
I
your
think
point is very well taken. Yeah.
yeah, like just that, like even as Canadian history goes on, where it's like we talk about like the settlement of the West or whatever. Again, it's still such like a weirdly intangible topic to talk about because of just how it was almost handled and how like you can't get a firm hold into Canadian history. I think really is my point. You can't.
Yeah.
The average person can't like take a hook and pull into it because there's it's very American history is this big wall, and then
Mhm.
Canadian history is this big pool. You know,
Yeah. I like that. I like that
and I think
analogy.
and I think that like the Northwest Passage and this it really epitomizes that. Like it is the most easy way to understand that analogy of how you just can't get like you cannot even begin to fathom the madness that went on for the search of the Northwest Passage and what that meant.
Right. Exactly. Except
And that's why,
150 people
except
died.
with the book. Yeah. And now we get to talk about this great book that delves into why this whole thing was just like, it was just so bonkers.
Right. Okay. So getting into the book. So as you were mentioning, A Discovery of Strangers here. So written in 1994, I think published in 95. So it would give Weeb his second Governor General's award, which I think well deserved. I really like this novel. I read it in its entirety. I know you only had time to read part of it, but again, Weeb is an excellent writer. I don't think I'll
Yeah.
ever find something I
Yeah. No,
dislike of
don't.
his. Yeah.
People should never take my non reading of the material as a sign that I did not like it.
Yeah.
It is just a sign of my laziness and procrastination.
Sometimes time. You do have a
And
full
sometimes
time
time.
job.
Yeah, I'm also yeah also working a full time job.
And specifically, and the reason why we focused on John Franklin in our discussion is that's when it takes place. The whole point of the
Mm-hmm.
novel, or the action of the novel, centers around Franklin's second expedition um, to the Arctic. And Weeb had actually written a nonfiction book, or a series of essays that talked about this particular moment as well. It's called Playing Dead, and it's very much seen as a precursor to A Discovery of Strangers as a novel, in which Weeb, I think, really interestingly explores his impressions of the North and the Inuit and the indigenous populations that are there, and kind of, as we were just talking about, coming to terms with what the North represents to the Canadian mindset as a thing and as a place, right? And
Mm-hmm.
as an idea. Um, so it is really interesting to read. I think it's on archive.org. If people want to read it, I would recommend
It's
it.
in
It's
an
an
archive.
interest.
It is. It is.
Right. Okay. I meant Playing Dead. I don't know about A Discovery. I know The Discovery of
Oh.
Strangers, but Playing Dead, I'm not sure. But
Oh.
yeah, basically, A Discovery of Strangers is a fictionalized account of that same meditation, right? Um, so he would basically, for people who listen to all our episodes, or who listen to that particular episode on the temptation of Big Bear, as we talked about in that episode, Weeb likes to weave in fiction and nonfiction into his narratives in a kind of experimental, slightly postmodern type of way, right? And he does that very much with A Discovery of Strangers as well, where he'll
Mm-hmm.
weave a fictionalized account of what happens, right? He creates these characters from real life people like Franklin and Dr. John Richardson and so on, and uh, Robert Hood, as well as weaving together native narratives and myths, but also journal accounts that actually did survive from this time. So all of these materials are interwoven to create a multi-layered narrative, right, of the North. I don't know. What are your, before we get into the specific passages that we selected as interesting to talk about, like, what are your impressions of this novel? Like, do you have anything that you want to say as an opening statement that you kind of liked or disliked or just thought was interesting about the book?
I really, because it is written in retrospect, so I think there's a very like tweaking the nose aspect to this novel when you read it from the perspective of the explorers. Like there's a very like wink wink sort of thing to it where they're almost like, God, you guys know that this is a train wreck, right? Like there's very much like you are watching a train run into a building full of orphan children right now,
Oh, no.
and you can't look away. Like you know what's going to happen. We all know what's going to happen, but it's just like he writes in a way where it's this very interesting way to look at it, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. Um,
And there's also, and again, that's of course interspiced with some very beautifully written sections about First Nations culture and the view of the world. But
absolutely.
as we'll get into, like the satire, the almost like I can't even call it satire because this is just what happened.
Yeah, exactly.
This is
Yeah, like
like you can't even call it it's like trying to say that the 2016 election was a satire. It's not. It's just what happened.
it's just politics, baby.
Yeah,
um,
that's just the political machine, baby.
hell yeah.
Let's do
So
another election in the middle of the pandemic just so we can have the same electoral map shakeout. Thanks, Trudeau.
slightly worse though. Anyway, so again, as we kind of alluded,
Didn't kill 129 people.
at least it's a, like that's the thing. Like we know how John Franklin is going to die, but where the novel takes place, it's like 20 years before that, right? He doesn't die in the novel, so it is slightly hopeful in that sense. But yeah, you still read these characters and like, oh, you're gonna starve to death in the ice anyway.
You deserve everything that's coming to you.
But that's the thing. It's like that's what I find good is that despite obviously being a colonialist, like I think that's one of Weeb's strengths as an author is that he obviously has sympathy towards indigenous people, as we've talked about on the show before, but he does paint these human characters, right? The colonialists are not just these stereotypical villains, they are people who are acting as they would, and they have their warts, then they have their good sides. They're people, right? And I think that's what makes it all the more heartbreaking to know that these people are just going to die a terrible death because yes, in one way they deserve it because they were idiots, but at the same time, like Weeb does such a beautiful job of creating complex characters out of them that you can't help but feel like, oh,
Mm-hmm.
like lives were lost in this case, and
Mm. Yeah,
that's a shame, right? So I think that's just a strength of Weeb's writing, but
shame,
fuck him at
real
the same
shame.
time. um, okay, so part of what we wanted to do here, and we were talking about this before recording this episode, is that because Mac and me as well, like don't necessarily always have time to read the entire things because we have lives outside the podcast,
Yeah,
is that
yeah, yeah. Patrick also doesn't like he doesn't read these in the same time span. For these books, Patrick's already read a lot of them,
yeah, exactly,
and this is a revisit, like because he's
exactly.
just that kind of history nerd.
And like that's what I study is can lit, so I kind of
Yeah,
have a lot of these books in the back of my pocket as well.
I
But
only accidentally studied Canlit.
that's true. But the whole point that we want to go with from now on, and we'll see how it goes, is to actually just address passages that we liked, like
Mm-hmm.
that. Whatever Mac or I managed to read or reread, like we'll be able to at least address specific parts of the book, and I think that'll make for a more interesting conversation. So Mac, why don't you kick us off with a passage that you wanted to talk about?
Sure. I just because we were already talking about how we write these characters. Let's talk about the docking of pay.
Okay. So do you want to set up a bit of context, like what's happening here? Why is this
So
particular passage important to you?
Yeah, so essentially what's happening is because this is all part of the expedition right now, right? And at the time they're interacting with the, how do you pronounce it? Dene people.
Right.
And so they've got translators, they've got people helping to like explore, hunters, etc. And they're in the middle of this standoff. Like there's like a standoff has come up over food, I believe it is, or something. Anyway, the standoff isn't important. What's important is how it's handled. And again, while Weeb is technically writing a fictional version of these accounts, you have to know that an interaction like this definitely would have happened. So Franklin and some of his British blokes are standing off against these First Nations people about what they're going to do. And Franklin's threatening them. He's saying, don't do this or I'll shoot you, blah, blah, blah. And his companion, who's sort of serving as the narrator of this section, makes a threat to dock their pay.
Absolutely. And I think that when they refer to Canadians as well, they're referring to French Canadian voyageurs in this case. So that's another
Yeah.
element that I think is there in this section, if I remember it correctly. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Okay. So that's what the voyageurs were, was French. Okay.
Yeah.
But still, like, again, this, and to me, this is such a beautiful, wonderfully ridiculous passage because it highlights just how much imperialism will assert itself into places where it is not needed, wanted, or cannot sustain itself.
It'll make itself
So,
needed, right? Through
yeah,
the importance of cash in this
docking the
case.
bay.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, go
And
ahead, read
again,
the
so like,
passage.
so this passage happens after the standoff. Everything gets resolved. Their base settles down for the night, and so this narrator reflects on it. Sight unseen, we named that Hunter Lake, and the voyagers spent the evening gorging themselves and laughing like the children they are. A mouthful of meat cures every ill. I do believe the sternest possible warnings, docked pay, and even cocked and leveled pistols, unfortunately, we are in no position to have them whip, mean no more to them than our daily reading of the scriptures, and they understand not a word of the English save curses. Lieutenant Franklin insists, however, that eventually the readings must have a beneficent effect, he alone remaining steadfast in Christian hope. So, like, even because that was the idea, like, even afterwards, this guy's reflecting, he's going, oh, docking their pay doesn't matter when we're all going to die in the middle of the wilderness.
Or literally in the middle of nowhere.
Yeah, like,
it's
my guy, like, a bear could eat you. Are you going to dock the bear's pay?
yeah, like, oh, I can still hunt and survive here. Can you without me? I love that. I agree. And this is a dynamic that comes up.
Well, it's also just,
Yeah, go ahead.
and again, this dynamic of like stern parent. I gave them a stern warning. I said I would take away their allowance. Like, dude, why the fuck do they care? You're not their dad.
They acknowledge it, like in the paragraph just before the one you read, right? The enormous irony in the light of our near annihilation was that they had killed 18 deer along the shore of the next lake at the end of the very portage the men had refused to carry. It's like they already figured the shit out. You were just being a dick
Yeah,
about it.
that's what it was. It's gonna be, yeah, okay. So that was the problem. They didn't want it. So those of you who don't know what portage is, it's like where you carry a canoe on your head.
Exactly.
Basically, when you need to carry canoes over land. So these guys were probably just tired after the day and they didn't want to portage at that time. But again, crushing imperialism says go, 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 go.
And
And it's just like,
yeah,
it's just wild to me. And it's, again, unfortunately, we are in no position to have them whipped. Like, dude, you would never get away with it. You're in the middle of nowhere. They could kill you, go off into the wilderness, and you would never see them again.
yeah, someone's gonna die
Nobody
in
would
their
find
sleep
your
if you do
body.
that. Yeah.
Nobody would find your body, son.
Just in that single passage, I think again, Weeb does a really good job of you know, condensing a lot of ideas in really efficient prose, I think, and that's one of his strengths as a writer. Where he, in that thing of docked pay and even cocked and leveled pistols are the most powerful warnings, so to speak, or at least that's the ones that he can imagine. The association of, you know, monetary value and violence, right, or military might and capital in this case, is one that was solidifying, right, over the course of the 17th and 18th and 19th centuries, throughout North America through imperialism. And I think that particular passage really captures that essence of like, well, I want to establish the dominance of money, and I need to do that through violence because otherwise no one would accept that, right? It's absurd as a concept. And that's how it partially continues to this very day, right? We see violence all the time in order to maintain particular economic standards and systems. But yeah, I really like that passage. Thank you very much for bringing that one up.
I could talk about the way that this path, same even with the prayers, the same way there's this admonition that the conversion of religion isn't working, but Franklin says we just got to keep trying.
Yep. You got to have that
we just have to keep
faith.
Trying to convert them.
Yep.
We have to keep trying to search for the Northwest Passage. We're gonna find it one day. Like, yes, the machine marches on.
The myth machine.
No, not even. What is it? The machine stops. That short story. Remember we read that?
Oh yeah. I love that one. The E.M. Forster one.
The machine. Yeah, the machine does not stop here. It just keeps going. This is the train wreck running into the orphanage. You can't stop it.
That's the thing. It's the beginning of the machine, right? It's the machine that's establishing itself in a way that's indicative, right? It's the expansion of the machine, and in a way that I think people are fully aware of now, because as you know, if we want to take again the monetary aspect of it, right? So British capitalism was establishing itself in North America. And as the first British colonists were arriving in the 17th century, it wasn't quite as solid a system, right? Barter and those kinds of ideas were still very much part of, the normal ways that we do things. But by the time you get to the North, that expansion of capital becomes so second nature, right? And so you see how it operates in the North American context in a very different way in the North than you would have seen in the early days of colonialism in the 13 colonies, for example, or New France. And I think that's an interesting way of looking at that passage as well, right? I don't know if you agree with me on that, but I don't know. That's the way I
agree with almost everything you say.
Okay, wonderful. Great.
You pick a passage now. Tell me where to go.
Okay. How about we read the first page, because it's great.
Yeah, and we both picked that one, I think.
Yeah, exactly. So this is the very opening passage that I'll read. And this is basically, to give a bit of context, the Europeans have not arrived yet, or at least, to be honest, it's a bit vague.
This is pre-contact.
Yeah, I think it's pre-contact. And we get the perspective of nature and animals on the first humans that are settling there.
Colonizers wearing contacts.
I think, I'm not sure, like maybe you have a different reading of this. It's either the first people, like the first indigenous people that are arriving, or it's the first Europeans that are arriving. And I'm not sure because they don't specify. It's just humans that Weeb calls them. But I'm not sure. So I'll read it, and that's not really the important part, I think, in this passage, but we'll talk about it. So this is how the book opens. The land is so long, and the people traveling in it so few, the curious animals barely notice them from one lifetime to the next. The human beings whose name is Tetsutin, live here with great care, their feet traveling year after year those paths where animals can easily avoid them if they want to, or follow or circle back ahead to watch them with little danger. Therefore, when the first one or two whites appeared in this country, an animal would have had to search for 4 lifetimes to find them being paddled about, or walking, or bent and staggering, somewhere on the inexorable land. So it is the whites, sorry. Yeah, was that the passage that you wanted to read, or was it the next one after?
No, it was the very first passage. The land is so long,
Right. Yeah. But even
and
just
I
a little
think
bit. Yeah.
If you want to read a bit of the next one, go ahead. I still think it's a very pretty passage.
Yeah, there's just like some really good stuff, and then we'll talk about it. About that time, some of the animals did begin to hear strange noises, bits of shriek and hammer above the wavering roar of rapids or the steady flagellation of wind. These were strangers, so different, so blatantly loud the caribou themselves could not help hearing them along before they needed to be smelled. And some animals drifted around to see what made the trees in one place scream and smash that way. The rocks clang. I'll stop there. But yeah, so I like this perspective that he takes. That's why I chose the passage. Is Weeb doesn't take a human centric approach from the get go of the novel. And I think that's why it's important, is because he makes the North a character. And he establishes that from the opening page, right? Arguably, right, it's the most important character. It's the main character, the land itself, the nature, uh, what it represents, as we were talking, and what how it feels, right? The wind feels flagellated. The rocks are clanging. There's damage being done to the land and nature as such. Right? I don't know if that's why you chose this particular passage, but to me, that was one of the main things that rang to me. Yeah, why did you choose this passage?
I really found the discussion interesting. Well, I found the introduction interesting just for how much it talked about like there had been people living here, but how deeply they lived with nature.
Yeah.
For generations, they had found a way to make the paths and connect them together. You were talking before, these people have been here for over 25,000 years at this point.
Yep.
These were probably this is like the people coming off of the land bridge.
Yeah. Yeah.
And this is the area they live in now, and how it just goes to show how ignorant colonial settlers were of the land they were entering. Like they had no idea what they were stepping into, and how just unbelievably unique this new frontier would have been. So I think this passage really highlights that very beautifully by having it from the perspective of the animals almost.
Absolutely. And this is something we talked about as well at the beginning, but I think this passage also encapsulates it quite well, right? The Northwest Passage is a myth, as we established, or it, in the broadest sense of like it performs better in the imagination. But
yeah,
what's interesting, I think, is that by the time that Franklin comes around with his expedition, it's no longer necessarily the Northwest Passage is there for exploration, as we were saying by this time, and less for like an easy passage to spices, because by the 19th century, it's less what the British are interested in and more resources as far as rock and wood and all of that. And I think this particular passage exemplifies that, right? The North is being explored for what it has to offer directly, right?
Not for what it is.
Exactly, right? The resource is the North itself, as land, as wood, as stone for building, the animals for food, right? Or fur, all of that, rather than just passage, right? Which is a completely different way of perceiving the land, right? One of them is, you're just walking through it and you leave it relatively intact, whereas the other one, you're exploiting it, right? It has a purpose for mercantile and then capitalist reasons. And so it completely shifts this perspective. And I think that transition is made very, very clear in this passage, right? Which is the other reason why I brought it up. Yeah. Anything you wanted to add about this particular passage?
I no, I I think it's just a great opener. Like it's just such a beautifully beautiful, especially because like it just shows how much, because eventually leads to things like the threatening of docking of pay.
Yeah, absolutely.
Like it really highlights how the absurdity being brought over. Like this isn't explorers entering a land of like the absurd. This isn't, because that's how these explorers see themselves, right? They are order in a world of chaos without realizing the other viewpoint that they are chaos entering into a world of order.
It's
And this first passage does a really good job of highlighting that.
We have, I think, two other passages, one or two, depending on what you choose. Do you want to go with the next one?
No, you can go. Go ahead.
So
I'll give you another one.
I think we have another similar one where the naming of places is brought up, right? This comes up a few times in the book, so we might not have the same passage. But the one I have is on page 30 of my
42?
version. But it's page 30 of my
Okay.
version, but it's the beginning of chapter 2, basically. So mine was just the opening section of chapter 2, which reads, "The lake they named after her later was no more than an infinitesimal detail in their grand attempt to rename the entire country. It is, however, questionable whether the English naval officers ever actually saw Greenstockings Lake. In their first coming, going north, they were portaged around by the Canadian voyageurs who had already carried them all those months of labor from Hudson Bay. And when those who were still alive appeared again out of the north 15 months later, they were quite incapable of seeing anything at all, except perhaps their own frozen feet blundering along the track of the Tetsotine hunters trapped down in front of them." So I read the whole paragraph, but for me, the interplay of sight and naming is what's really interesting about this passage. And probably the passage that you brought up as well is similar in its vibe. I don't know. But the idea of controlling a place by naming it is obviously very important to imperialism, right? You own it by attributing, a new name to it. You saw it with slavery, for example, and you see it with place naming, right? How many places in the world are named after Queen Victoria? It's not a coincidence, right? Like
how many places are named themselves? The
right.
Gobi Desert, desert,
Sahara Desert.
It's like saying you want chai tea. That's TT.
Yes. Although apparently tea and chai is not the same thing. It like comes from different. I think.
No, it's just a Spider-Verse joke.
Yeah. Okay. Anyway, point is, I thought this passage was really interesting, and the way that Weeb interplays the lack of necessity for British colonizers to see a place does not necessarily mean that they do not claim ownership over it, right? And that's what we've talked about before, right? The idea of mapping, for example, is very much intrinsic to that, right? There's a certain type of site that's being attributed, right? I see the mathematical and the very detail-oriented vision of this land, but it's not necessarily the same site that you see of embracing and recognizing the different aspects and beauties of the land as more than just resource or more than just how could I say it, passage, to bring it back to the Northwest Passage in this case. And I thought that's why this passage was interesting. Yeah. I don't know.
And I just find it interesting because they named it after somebody, and the name is Greenstockings.
Yeah, the Greenstockings is one of the indigenous people. She's the indigenous love interest of this book, right? Greenstockings is not her actual name, of course. Again, she was renamed this by the Europeans. And she would have.
Oh, so it's purposeful to name her after a material thing that you can buy and purchase and own.
Heyo, there you go.
It's a metaphor.
Ah, who knew? But yeah,
Oh.
that's actually like a sub theme. We didn't really talk about it because that's less of the focus that we're taking for this episode. But yeah, it's a sub theme because she has a relationship with one of the explorers, and it's Weeb's way of kind of exploring this idea of conflicting, cultures in a more micro level, right? But yeah, so
cultures don't conflict. Gosh, they just assimilate.
Right.
And that's not a conflict. Assimilation isn't conflict. Assimilation is an upgrade. Thank you very much.
Yeah. But no, but you're actually right. And I think that point is doubly true because the lake is named after the woman in this case, who's named after a material thing. So there's like a doubling that's happening of ownership of both the land and woman.
Well, it's not. It's also just.
Right?
It's also just like there's not even a consideration that this lake might already even have a name.
Right. Of course. Yeah.
So that adds another layer of ownership because this is theft.
Yes, it is theft, and yeah, it's re-envisioning.
But isn't all capitalism just theft?
I mean, comrade, you're getting to the heart of the issue, right?
Throw down your shackles, people.
Hell yeah. Anyway,
it feels good to make a communism joke. It feels like we're actually back now.
Now I can breathe. Now I can get back into the rhythm of the show. Yeah, I think that's
yes.
I think that's good. But yeah, we've been going at it for like an hour and a half. Do you want to go with one last passage on your end, and then we'll call it there?
Sure. I picked one more. So because we had sort of broad categories for our passages. So we've talked about the forcing natural and social changes for control, talking about the naming of places and the docking of pay. We talked a bit about the landscape. So the last passage, I'll pick my last one, which is about the shift in purpose of the Northwest Passage, which we've touched on a little bit. Basically, just talking about this idea that the Northwest Passage, while originally for spices, would become something very, very different. So mine from the Internet Archive is on page 147. It's in the entering exhaustion. It's very close to the beginning. Yeah, it's on like the next page of entering exhaustion, which is one of the chapter titles.
Yeah, chapter 7.
And and it's this idea because again, the machine is always running, right? And so these guys are pushing themselves. And Bird's Eye is a character, yes.
Yes.
Is that? Yeah, Bird's Eye is one of their guides, I believe.
I honestly read this like 2 weeks ago. I finished it 2 weeks ago, so yes, I want to say, but I can't remember what his role within the actual group is specifically. I think he's a warrior, but I'm not 100% sure. Or a shaman. Anyway, one or the other. Anyway, go on.
Yeah, anyway, so Bird's Eye is there leading them on this path. And eventually, because they are pushing themselves to the point of like exhaustion and death, Bird's Eye forcibly makes them slow down.
Mm-hmm.
They set a much slower pace, and they begin to see nature again.
Yeah.
And I think it's actually a very beautiful like shift because this Northwest Passage almost allows for a rediscovery of nature. And I'll get more into that after I read the passage. I want to read this first and then we'll talk more about it.
Good.
But even as Bird's Eye weaves this continuous whisper of fact and understanding and judgment into the growing dark, the ceaseless travel of the white mud begins to tire her, and she forces them to move more slowly. More and more slowly from where they have been to where they plan to go, without knowing what waits for them there, and which they anticipate with both joy and fearful trepidation. Her gradual slowness teaches them to savor details, whether they wish to or not. Sometimes for an entire day, she describes one single rock they must pass in the crooked river of their journey, describes every individual plane, slope, twist, and crack of it, every textured grain and worn corner exactly there where, against it, the swift water smashes itself into white foam and then instantly refolds down, like a glazed sheet, ribbed and smooth for that one slipping instant in which they can finally pass over it.
Beautiful.
And wait, I think we really need to talk about this part of imperialism and rediscovering nature, simply because there's this idea, like, you have to remember, imperialism means these people haven't seen real nature in years. You don't have real nature in Europe at this point. It's all very carefully curated, very like looked after, taken control of, very like put in orderly fashion.
Yeah.
I'm not saying there isn't nature, there isn't trees and forests, but it's very like
it's a different perspective. Yeah,
it's a very well maintained. Yeah. This is nature in its most raw form.
Right.
And so the fact the Northwest Passage in its own way becomes a kind of pilgrimage to reconnect with that natural raw form of nature, the search, the expeditions, and everything. And so Birdseye sort of forcing them to slow down and realize that is, I think, a very like important message, Yeah. Slow down, restart yourselves, reboot your perspective.
And
remember what it means to be in nature.
Right. This reminds me, this is again perhaps my more academic side that's showing through here, but one of the people that I've had to read over time is a person called Nigel Clark, who talks about the asymmetrical relationship between nature and humans, right? That needs to be re-acknowledged as far as our re-grasping of climate catastrophe, right? So he's writing from a very 21st century perspective, of course, but I think reading a passage like this very much gets to the heart of that idea, and I think connects well to what you're saying in this case, where when you take the time to actually consider it and think about it, right, nature's predominance and the environment's power that it can have over people is very clear. We just don't necessarily take the time to appreciate it, or, as you were saying, in European and now North American contexts, right, it's been kind of very much put down through very deliberate resource management or beautification projects or whatever, right? And you miss out this raw power that the environment has, and not necessarily in a violent way, but just in a almost sublime way in this particular passage, that I think is very, very nice to think about. And I really like that you brought up this passage. I totally agree with you. Yeah.
And I think it's again, it's a part of that epitome of just Canada is the fake environmental country. No two shits, no two ways about it. But I think there's still some ringing truth to that, of why people will come to this country to find this and it's still there. I really believe this is one of the few countries that still has that kind of true raw nature living within it in its natural world.
Yeah. I was just talking to someone actually today whose job has him based in Jasper. And he's like, the job's fine, but I get to wake up every morning and I'm in Jasper, Alberta. Like, it's just overwhelmingly beautiful every morning. And that's what made his particular position so worthwhile, is like, okay, I make money and all that, but that sense.
That was me working in the Yukon.
Right, exactly. Yeah, there's
like literally I wake up and fucking Logan Mountains or not Logan Mountain, you can't see Logan, but like these mountains are just sitting there, and I'm just like, my God,
right,
this is my walk to work.
And you were mentioning the West, right, earlier, the Western Canada, and like when we'll talk about it in a few episodes in this case, but like a lot of the literature contends with that, right? This idea of like, there's just like this vast open space of nature.
Yeah.
We don't recognize that there's indigenous populations in this case, but there's just open landscape, and like, how do you deal with this on an emotional level? And a lot, that's why there was some interesting literature that was brought about it, because it tried to channel that, right? But yeah, like I definitely agree in this case. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it shifts the passage into the Northwest Passage, really playing into just a central core tenet of Canadian history in that way, like this pilgrimage of nature, because you had some other passages that we haven't really had time to talk about, but this pilgrimage of humanity.
Yeah.
It's I just really think it's a really beautiful way to talk about it.
Absolutely.
It's that intangible. It's hard to talk about because again, it's intangible. There's an intangible quality to something like the search for the Northwest Passage, as ridiculous as it sounds.
No, but I think that's true, and like that's why we refer to it as a myth. It's not just because it's non-existent that we refer to it as that, but because there's, again, to use that term again, there's
because now, like, we can make a Northwest Passage, and climate change has basically made a Northwest Passage for us at this point. But that's not the point.
Exactly. Like the whole thing is like climate change made it possible, but it also removes its power as an idea, right? It's not impressive anymore. It's just like, oh, okay, now you can just smash through it. All right. I'm like, I don't want to go there.
But it used to be, it was something like, because it used to be this big idea of you can't conquer it. You cannot force it. You live with it.
Right.
You live with the ice and the nature and the everything in the same way that the people who first lived here did.
Yeah. When we were talking,
space, that was the sort of mythic quality.
Yeah. When we were talking about the Stan Rogers song, and we were like, that's a weird flex, but at the same time, like, he wrote that song in the 60s before there were the icebreakers that just kind of went through it, or not as prevalent, I would say. But like that imaginary was still there, right? Of this mythical passage. So like that's kind of what he was getting at in that song, right? There's something overwhelming about imagining it, and that passage, that last passage that you brought up, is, I think, both indicative of that, and also why someone like Weeb would see the North as emblematic to the Canadian mindscape, right? And the Canadian identity, is because it represents that intangibility that is so central to a lot of the way that Canadian identity is framed, right? Of just not quite knowing, right? For all kinds of reasons, good and bad. But yeah, I think it really does, on an intangible level, get to that. Yeah, I think that's I don't think there was a better passage to end on in this case.
I don't think there's a better way to finish the podcast at this point.
All right.
Nailed it.
Fuck yeah.
Who says you need to read the book? Not me.
But I think
that's my honors of English literature that way, baby.
I think that was a good way of operating, though. Like, I didn't hate that idea of like just choosing passages and reading something.
No, I'm down for that. Continuing moving forward.
Oh, cool.
I think we hit on all the big ideas of the novel.
Exactly. Yeah. All right. Cool. So thanks everyone for listening. Mac, where can they support us? Remind the people of support opportunities.
Well, first of all, number one way to support the show, just keep on listening.
Yep.
Second of all, we are working on sponsorships and ads. So if you guys can give those things a quick visit or a quick look, it actually helps us, because we can then point to that and say that we are bringing in viewership for you people, which is always nice. You can, if you have any questions, comments, concerns, or critiques, you can reach out on Facebook and by email. I'm pretty sure we've wiped our Twitter from existence.
Yeah, Twitter no longer
because
exists.
Twitter's a hellhole, and we don't want to pay for a blue tick. If somebody wants to be Historia Canadian on Twitter, go ahead. We don't care.
Please don't.
You can support the show through PayPal, So you can sort of like just be like, hey, I'm gonna toss a couple bucks these guys' way, help them pay for their next pizza dinner when they see each other in December.
Hell yeah.
Or you can do so through affiliate links in our recommended reading page we set. Finally, the big way is we have our Patreon page. So you can find perks like extra ad-free episodes. You can listen to my series Pop Canada, where we dive a bit more into like modern day Canada. Anyway, this is all still optional though. This is all free, independent. We are not a show that is like governed by the whims of others. We do this as just a couple of guys being dumb.
Two Canlit boys playing with their Canlit toys.
Yo, was I the one that said that first? I can't remember at this point.
Doesn't matter.
Anyway,
leave a
couple
review.
Of Canlit boys playing with their Canlit toys. If you want, you can leave a review. We always love that. We always love hearing what people think. Next time, we'll be talking about some other book, some other intangible part of Canada. Anyway, no matter what topic we pick, you can be sure that we will be here to be just the absolute worst guides through it.
And that's why you love us.
As always, he's Patrick. I'm Mac. Take us out with a cheers.
Cheers, everyone.